Star Wars, as a property, has always had a presence in the video game realm. The original trilogy of films were released between 1977 and 1983, the prime years of the games industry's first boom period. And as such, games based on all three films dropped not only in arcades, but home systems like the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, the Intellivision, and the ColecoVision in the years immediately following the film's release. As the 90s barreled on, a ton of games were released with Star Wars branding or set in the Star Wars universe, most of which were greeted with high critical acclaim. Like 1993's Star Wars X-Wing for PC, 1996's Star Wars Rogue Squadron for the N64, platform shooters like the Super Star Wars series on Super Nintendo, and first-person shooters like Star Wars Dark Forces and Star Wars Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith. But in 1999, Star Wars ventured into a genre it had never before broached: the racing game. In the spring of 1999, the world was gripped by Star Wars obsession once again, as the franchise's first feature film in 16 years was being released, a prequel called Star Wars Episode I: The Phantom Menace. Pre-release excitement was at a fevered pitch, and the film itself seemingly grossed all of the money available at the time on original release. But the critical response was tepid, and its legacy reputation situated it as a muddled disappointment. The one segment that reviewers and audiences alike found lots of praise for, though, was an early sequence where youthful protagonist Anakin Skywalker fights for his freedom by participating in a high-speed racing competition of floating crafts called pod racers. The pod racing scene is intense, immediate, and breathtaking in a way little else in the film was, and became an iconic sequence in franchise lore, even as the rest of the film faltered. There were a wave of Phantom Menace-based games, including an action game that had you playing through the plot of the film. But just as in the film, only one really did anything that anybody liked. A game based on the pod racing sequence, called Star Wars Episode I: RACER. Now you might be thinking, why is it just called RACER? Why not Pod Racer? Well, developer and publisher LucasArts discovered that another company apparently had rights to titles with the word pod in them, so they had to settle for the less elegant RACER. Luckily, everyone could just call it Pod Racer anyway, if they so chose. Episode I: RACER focuses on the film's big depicted race on the desert planet Tatooine, and expands the details of the sequence. Actors Jake Lloyd and Lewis McLeod reprise their roles as Anakin and his main racing rival, the arrogant favorite Sebulba. And the game gives you the opportunity to select meticulously recreated versions of them and every other character in the scene as well. Quirky aliens of all nationalities that we barely glimpse in the film, much less know them by name. But here, you get very familiar with guys like Odie Mandrell, Abe Endicott, Gasgano, and Dud Bolt. There's so much Star Wars lore out there. Every single detail has been turned into a novel, or a comic, or a thread. While the developers had the facts of the lore, what they didn't have was much footage. Since the game was coming out the day before the movie released, they really had to produce a lot of material on assumption, crafting a physics simulation from only a few short clips. But they really managed to efficiently recreate the experience of the sequence well, especially the speed. Episode I: RACER is maybe the fastest feeling game I've ever played, and that breakneck tension is the best thing here. My favorite classic racing games tend to be the ones that value quick reaction time rather than realistic drift. And Episode I: RACER requires your reflexes to work at lightning speed as you navigate around the extremely tight turns and corridors at what feels like a face-melting rapidity. It's a fine line. If you walk it too tightly, it boils over into becoming a frustrating crash simulator, like Suzuki All-Star Extreme Racing. Instead, it hews closer to something like Hydro Thunder, and manages to be just difficult enough to be exhilarating. I have rarely been as compelled to yell out, "Woo! Oh man, just made it! Oh man, what the hell?" during a racing game quite as often, and certainly not for anything good, as my audio recordings for other games that fall on the wrong sides of these challenging lines, games like the ruthlessly exacting Monaco Grand Prix or the utterly broken Roadsters, can attest. Episode 1 RACER isn't super deep, and you can get through the game's 7 tracks fairly quickly. Technically, beating each track unlocks new racers, but they're all just random Star Wars aliens anyway, so it's only so enlivening to your playtime. The game also has a fairly robust upgrade system, but it's not a particularly challenging game competition-wise, at least against the computer, especially compared to something like the brutally challenging Hydro Thunder, so I wasn't really compelled to tinker too often. But those races are all so fun and well-designed, and it's hard not to have a good time with the breathtaking speed of this thing, as fast as any racing game I've ever experienced. Episode 1 RACER was originally released on the console level exclusively for the Nintendo 64, again the day before the release of the film in May of 1999. The upscaled and visually improved Dreamcast port, adding a bunch of goofy but vividly realized cutscenes in between the races, didn't manage to manifest in stores until April of 2000, nearly a full year after the release, even being beaten by a pretty hilariously aspirational Game Boy Color release around the previous Christmas. This was long enough that the book had pretty much been closed on the Phantom Menace as a film. Its reputation as mostly a too somber, sluggish, overly chatty film, too obsessed with the minutiae of trade routes and political wrangling at the expense of blockbuster excitement, pretty much set in stone. But the pod racing scenes were rightly lionized as a much-needed shot in the arm, and Episode 1 RACER recreates that experience to a T. There have been many Star Wars films and many Star Wars games since, but there's little in them that would constitute racing competition, so Episode 1 RACER remains a charming little anomaly in the franchise roster, and a damn fun game to boot. Next time, you ever wanted a pod racing game, but set on Earth, and driving on the ground, and instead of breakneck speed, you have to stop every few seconds to do a little turn? I got you.